Joining me for more on this is Derek Crow, political director at Brave New Foundation. So, Derek, which is it? Are we broke or what?
Well, we've got money. I think that's what this adventure in Libya shows. It's just that we don't have the right priorities. As you pointed out in your earlier segment, that first day of the war in Libya cost us $100 million at least. And you're hearing here in the United States that we're going to have to live with draconian cuts to basic services that keep people from falling through the cracks. So it's very clear to me, at least, that we have plenty of money in the United States when it meets the priorities of our policymakers, just none for the people out in the country.
Well, like comedian Jon Stewart said, probably in a lot funnier way than I ever can, you can't fire Tomahawk missiles and teachers at the same time. But doesn't this undercut the whole narrative that we keep hearing in Washington about how we're broke, when we suddenly can find money for conflicts abroad?
Well, I think Jon Stewart actually kind of got it backwards a little bit. You actually can fire Tomahawk missiles and fire teachers at the same time. In fact, here in Texas, I spoke about this on one of your past segments, that my wife is a teacher here in Texas, and she's been caught in the layoffs. So it's absolutely true that we have plenty of money for things like war, for companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, which makes the Tomahawk cruise missile. We just don't have anything to educate our children, apparently. And I think that points out just a broader problem in the American political system, that our leaders aren't hearing us when we're telling them things like most likely voters want out of Afghanistan, for instance.
Now, what do you think accounts for the fact that we chose Libya? Obviously, we've been hearing this term humanitarian crisis, right? But, I mean, Libya is not the only place in the world where there are people who need help, perhaps, in overcoming whatever leaders they have in power.
Absolutely. And, you know, I don't want to deny that there are folks who back a no-fly zone who have good intentions or are going in this in good faith. But I think if you look at the contrast between what we're doing in Libya and what we're not doing in places like Bahrain or Yemen or other places, it's very clear that the determinant here is whether there's a U.S. national security interest involved with oil prices and oil reserves. I mean, you just look at it, and that's just got to be what it is. Senator Webb said as much in his recent interviews, that this has much more to do with where the oil is than where the humanitarian crises are.
And Congressman John Markey said the same thing. But I have to ask, I mean, we keep hearing about this whole war for oil debate. And like I asked at my previous guest, we heard the same exact justification in the buildup to the war in Iraq. What we've learned from the debacle in Iraq is that invading a country and using heavy air force and getting our troops on the ground, which thankfully we're not doing in Libya yet, doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have access or cheaper oil somehow.
That's absolutely true. I mean, the Iraq war, one of the chief costs of that war to the U.S. economy was the damage that it did by causing oil prices to go through the roof. And if you look at places like Afghanistan, where there's not significant oil reserves, even being in that country is costing $400 per tank of gas for the U.S. military. So it increases the demand for oil, which drives up, the price for it. But there's this broader concern with the United States trying to find what amounts to a military solution to every problem around the world. And we just can't sustain that on the budget that they're telling us we have to live within in the United States.
Now, what do you make of this sort of split, I guess, in the Obama administration? Because I'm sure if it were President Bush going into Libya, the left would be up in arms. And yet you have, a lot of folks who sort of cut their teeth on the Bosnian crisis, where they suddenly discovered that there's such a thing as so-called humanitarian wars, right? So you don't have as much of the criticism from the left of this conflict because Obama really is selling it under these humanitarian auspices. What do you make of that break?
Well, I think that that's a problem in the way Americans think about bombs in general. I mean, we kind of think that our missiles help humanitarian situations. But, I mean, if you think about the Iraq war, we keep bringing it up. In the first 50 so-called precision strikes in the Iraq war, none of them hit their intended target. And I don't think that's something that we're thinking about when we're talking about helping with missiles. Those missiles are only as good as the intelligence that targets them, or the people that target them, or the people we're working with on the ground to locate those targets. And so this idea that you can drop a bomb in a place where there's a mix of civilian and military placements and not kill people that are innocent inside the conflict is just, it's a fantasy. And it's something that drives this warped view that Americans have about military force being something that can help rather than its basic function, which is to destroy the enemies of the United States.
But why haven't we learned our lesson in Iraq? I mean, there's folks like yourself, there's the organization that you represent. I mean, there's so many people out there trying to bring that message out on a daily level, and we still don't seem to have any sort of understanding of the lessons that we should have learned in those other conflicts.
Well, I'd make 3 points in response to that. The first is that the American people are very cognizant of the disconnect between whether war helps. I mean, most Americans want us to cut military spending far before we cut things like Social Security and Medicare. The second is that, unfortunately, inside Washington, there's this bubble that's created that lionizes the use of military force as this quote-unquote greatest force for good in the world, end quote. And finally, there's a lot of money in making war. One of the most powerful lobbies inside Washington, D.C. is the defense contractor lobby, and those places have disseminated their manufactories and the places where they have people working on the weapons throughout every congressional district in the United States. So there's a lot of pressure on members of Congress to say yes to things that send money to companies that are making weapons in their district.
All right, well, you brought up Americans and sort of this perception that we have this greatest force for good in the world, and I